After months of living in fear of my husband's obsessed ex, we finally escaped her clutches. Now we're rebuilding our lives and learning to find peace again. Jake and I had finally settled into a comfortable routine. Our life together was everything I had hoped for, calm, steady, and filled with little moments of joy that made even the most mundane days feel special. We had our favorite spots in town, our shared hobbies, and plans for the future that seemed bright and full of promise. It felt like nothing could disrupt the happiness we had built. But then Claire reappeared, and everything changed. Jake had mentioned Claire to me a few times, a brief relationship that had ended amicably years before we met. She was just a name in his past, someone who hadn't crossed my mind in the years we'd been together. So when she suddenly resurfaced, I didn't know what to think. It all started one afternoon when Jake and I were out for a walk. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with the first hints of autumn in the air. We were talking about our weekend plans when I noticed a woman approaching us. She was tall, with long dark hair, and as she got closer, her face lit up with a wide smile. "Jake?" she called out, her voice full of surprise and excitement. "Is that really you?" Jake turned, and the moment he saw her, his expression froze. "Claire?" he replied, clearly caught off guard. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here." "I just moved back to town," Claire said, her eyes flicking over to me for a brief moment before returning to Jake. "It's so good to see you. You look great." Jake introduced me, and I offered a polite smile, though something about the way Claire was looking at him made me uneasy. She seemed almost too happy to see him, too eager to reconnect. But I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself I was just being overly sensitive. After a few minutes of small talk, Claire mentioned how she'd love to catch up properly sometime, maybe grab coffee or lunch. Jake, trying to be polite, nodded, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. Claire gave us a little wave as she walked away, but the unease she left behind lingered long after she was gone. "That was unexpected," I said as we continued our walk, trying to read Jake's expression. "Yeah," Jake agreed, still looking a bit shaken. "I haven't seen Claire in years. I had no idea she was back in town." "Do you think she wants to rekindle something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light but unable to hide the slight edge in my voice. Jake shook his head. "No, I don't think so. We ended things a long time ago, and it was mutual. She's probably just being friendly." I nodded, but the feeling of unease remained. Something about Claire's energy had unsettled me, but I didn't want to read too much into it. After all, she was just an ex, and Jake had moved on long before we met. But over the next few days, Claire started popping up more and more. It seemed like everywhere we went, she was there. At the grocery store, at our favorite coffee shop, even at the park where we often went for walks. Each time she would greet Jake with that same overly enthusiastic smile, acting as if they were old friends who had simply lost touch. At first I tried to brush it off as coincidence, but as the encounters became more frequent, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. Claire was always just a little too eager, a little too familiar, and I started to wonder if she was really as innocent as she seemed. Then the messages began. Jake started receiving texts from an unknown number. The first one was simple. "Hey, it's Claire! Great seeing you the other day. Hope you're doing well." It was friendly enough, but it felt strange that she had tracked down his number without asking. Jake showed me the message, and we both agreed it was probably nothing to worry about. But the texts kept coming. At first, they were just casual check-ins. "Saw something today that reminded me of you," or "Hope you and your wife are having a great weekend." But then, they started to take on a different tone. Claire began reminiscing about their past, bringing up old memories that Jake had long since left behind. She mentioned places they used to go together, things they used to do, all with a wistful undertone that made me uncomfortable. Jake didn't respond to most of the messages, hoping Claire would get the hint and back off. But instead of fading away, her messages became more frequent, more personal. She started sending pictures, old photos of the two of them together taken during their relationship years ago. Each message felt like Claire was trying to pull Jake back into her world, to remind him of what they once had. One evening, after yet another message from Claire had appeared on Jake's phone, I couldn't hold back my concern any longer. "Jake, don't you think this is getting out of hand?" I asked, my voice tinged with worry. She's clearly not letting go. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I think you're right. I'll talk to her. I need to make it clear that I'm happily married, and that she needs to move on." The next day, Jake sent Claire a firm but polite message. He told her that while it had been nice to catch up, it wasn't appropriate for them to stay in contact. He emphasized that he was committed to me and that their relationship was in the past. I felt a wave of relief when he showed me the message, hoping it would finally put an end to Claire's unwanted attention. But it didn't. Instead of backing off, Claire's behavior escalated. The messages continued, but now they were filled with longing and desperation. She talked about how much she missed Jake, how she believed they had something special that couldn't be replaced. Her words were laced with a sense of urgency, as if she was trying to convince Jake that he had made a mistake by moving on. Jake stopped responding altogether, hoping that Claire would eventually give up. But she didn't seem to care that her messages were going unanswered. In fact, it seemed to fuel her obsession even more. Then one evening there was a knock at our door. We were in the middle of dinner, enjoying a quiet night at home, when the unexpected sound startled us both. I glanced at Jake, who looked just as surprised as I felt. We weren't expecting anyone, and it was late for a neighborly visit. Jake got up to answer the door, and when he opened it, there stood Claire, holding a bottle of wine and smiling as if she had been invited. "Hi, Jake," she said, her voice soft and sweet. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I brought some wine. I thought we could catch up, just like old times." Jake's expression hardened, but he kept his voice calm. "Claire, it's late, and we're in the middle of dinner. This isn't a good time." Claire's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes flicking to me before returning to Jake. "Oh, I didn't mean to intrude," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I just miss our talks, you know. It would be nice to catch up." Jake shook his head, his voice firm. "Claire, I've made it clear that I'm happy with my wife. This isn't appropriate. You need to stop." For a moment, Claire just stood there, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, the bottle of wine still in her hand. Jake closed the door and let out a long breath, leaning against it as if he could block out the entire encounter. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at me with a mixture of frustration and guilt. "I didn't think she'd take it this far." "It's not your fault," I said, though the unease in my stomach hadn't gone away. "But I think we need to be careful. She doesn't seem to be handling this well." Jake nodded, his expression troubled. "I'll make sure she knows not to come by again, but if she keeps pushing, we might need to take more serious steps." We hoped that would be the end of it, but deep down, I knew better. Claire wasn't just trying to reconnect. She was trying to force her way back into Jake's life. And I had a sinking feeling that she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. As the days went by, my fears were confirmed. Claire's behavior became more erratic, more intrusive. She started showing up outside our house, claiming she was just in the neighborhood, asking if Jake wanted to grab coffee or go for a walk. Each time, Jake politely but firmly told her no, but Claire didn't seem to care. It was as if she couldn't or wouldn't take no for an answer. And then one evening everything changed. Jake and I were sitting on the couch watching a movie when his phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at it, his face going pale as he read the screen. Without a word, he handed me the phone. The message was from Claire. It was short, but it sent chills down my spine. "I can't stop thinking about you. We need to talk. I'm coming over." My heart raced as I looked at Jake, fear and anger boiling inside me. "She's not coming over, Jake. We're calling the police." Jake nodded, already reaching for his phone. "This has gone too far." As Jake dialed 911, I felt a surge of anxiety. Claire wasn't just being persistent, she was becoming unhinged, and I had no idea what she was capable of. When the police arrived, they took our statements and advised us to file a restraining order. They also recommended that we document everything, every message, every encounter, so that we had a record of Claire's escalating behavior. It wasn't the immediate solution I had hoped for, but it was a start. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just beginning a battle we hadn't asked for. Claire's obsession with Jake was far more dangerous than I had realized, and I was terrified of what she might do next. And as I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept running through my mind. We weren't safe anymore. The morning after Claire's ominous message and the visit from the police, Jake and I were both on edge. The comforting routine we once had felt distant, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that neither of us could shake. Claire had made it clear she wasn't going to back down, and now, the sense of safety we had taken for granted was gone. We spent the day filing for a restraining order, a process that was both exhausting and surreal. The courthouse was busy, full of people with their own problems, and yet all I could think about was how our lives had suddenly spiraled into something out of a nightmare. As we filled out the paperwork, recounting every interaction with Claire, it became all too real. This was no longer just an uncomfortable situation with an ex. It was a serious threat to our safety. Jake was quiet as we drove home. I could tell he was angry. Angry at Claire, at the situation, at the fact that we had been forced to take such drastic measures just to protect ourselves. I wanted to say something to comfort him, but I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I was just as scared as he was. "We're going to get through this," Jake finally said, breaking the silence as we pulled into the driveway. "We're doing everything we can. Once the restraining order is in place, she'll have to back off." "I hope so," I replied, though the doubt in my voice was unmistakable. The restraining order was granted quickly thanks to the evidence we had gathered and the seriousness of Claire's behavior. The police assured us that they would enforce it strictly, and that any violation on Claire's part would lead to her immediate arrest. It was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the fear that had taken hold of our lives. For a few days things were quiet. Claire didn't try to contact us, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope that maybe she had finally gotten the message. Maybe the restraining order had scared her off, and we could start to rebuild our sense of normalcy. But the peace didn't last. One afternoon, about a week after the restraining order was issued, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. I opened it, expecting a simple message or maybe a funny picture to lighten the day, but instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. "I'm pretty sure she's outside our house right now. Stay where you are. I'm calling the police." I felt a surge of panic as I reread the message, my hands shaking. Claire was back. She had found a way to violate the restraining order, and now she was outside our home waiting. I wanted to rush home, to be with Jake, but I knew he was right. I needed to stay where I was and let the police handle it. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for an update from Jake. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. I couldn't concentrate on anything, my thoughts consumed with the fear that Claire would somehow manage to get to Jake, that this would be the moment when everything went horribly wrong. Finally, my phone buzzed again. It was Jake, and I opened the message with trembling hands. "The police got here in time. They found her outside, but she didn't try anything. They've arrested her for violating the restraining order. She's in custody now." Relief washed over me so intense that I nearly collapsed into my chair. Claire was in custody. The police had arrived in time, and for the moment we were safe. But even as I let out a shaky breath, the fear didn't completely go away. Claire had been arrested, but what would happen next? How long would she be held? Would she be released only to come after us again? When I got home that evening, Jake was sitting on the couch looking exhausted but relieved. I rushed to him, pulling him into a tight hug. We held each other for a long time, neither of us saying anything, just grateful to be together and safe. "They took her away," Jake finally said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "She didn't resist, just stood there like nothing was wrong. I don't understand how someone can be so detached. I don't either, I whispered, pulling back to look at him. But she's gone now, and that's what matters. We're safe. Jake nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I just don't know how long that will last. What if they release her? What if she comes back? I don't know, I admitted, the same fears echoing in my mind. But we have to take it one step at a time. We're doing everything we can, and we'll deal with whatever comes next. The days that followed were tense. We knew that Claire wouldn't be held indefinitely, and that at some point we would have to face the possibility of her return. The fear was like a shadow following us everywhere, making it hard to focus on anything else. Jake and I talked about moving, leaving town entirely and starting over somewhere else, where Claire wouldn't be able to find us. It was a drastic measure, but it seemed like the only way to truly escape her clutches. We started researching new places to live, looking for somewhere far enough away that it would be difficult for Claire to track us down. But even as we made plans to move, the anxiety remained. The thought of uprooting our lives, of leaving behind everything we had built, was overwhelming, and the fear that Claire might somehow find us, no matter where we went, was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. Then one afternoon I received a call from the police. The officer informed me that Claire had been released on bail, but that she was under strict orders to stay away from us. They assured me that they were monitoring her closely and that any attempt to contact us would result in her immediate rearrest. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Claire was out. She was free, and no amount of monitoring or legal orders could erase the fact that she was no longer behind bars. The safety we had begun to feel was shattered in an instant, replaced by the all-too-familiar dread that had haunted us for months. When I told Jake, I could see the same fear and frustration reflected in his eyes. We had been through so much, and it felt like no matter what we did, Claire would always find a way to insert herself back into our lives. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice firm. "We can't stay here and wait for her to come after us again. We need to move as soon as possible." I agreed. Staying in town, knowing that Claire was out there, was no longer an option. We needed to put as much distance between us and her as possible, to find a place where we could finally start to rebuild our lives without the constant fear of her return. Over the next few days we made arrangements to move. We found a place out of state, far from anyone who knew us or Claire, and began the process of packing up our lives. It was a difficult and emotional time, saying goodbye to the home we had loved, the life we had built, but it was necessary. We couldn't continue living under the threat of Claire's obsession. As we packed the last of our belongings into the moving truck, I took one final look at our house. It had been our sanctuary, our safe space, but now it was just a reminder of everything we had been through. It was time to move on, to start fresh somewhere new. The drive to our new home was long and quiet. Jake and I didn't talk much, both of us lost in our thoughts. The fear was still there, a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach, but there was also a glimmer of hope. We were taking control of our lives, making the choice to leave the fear behind and start over. When we arrived at our new house, it felt strange, unfamiliar and unsettling, but also filled with potential. It was smaller than our old home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by trees. It was exactly the kind of place we needed, a place to heal, to find peace. We spent the first few days unpacking, trying to settle in and make the house feel like home. But the fear lingered, making it hard to relax. I found myself constantly checking the locks, glancing out the windows, half expecting to see Claire standing outside. The trauma of the past few months had left deep scars, and it would take time to fully feel safe again. Jake and I talked about going to therapy, knowing that we needed help to process everything we had been through. The idea of sharing our story with a stranger was daunting, but we knew it was necessary if we wanted to truly move on. One evening, about a week after we moved in, Jake and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The air was cool and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos we had left behind. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm. "We did the right thing," Jake said quietly, breaking the silence. "Leaving, starting over, it was the only way." "I know," I replied, taking his hand. "It's going to take time, but we'll get there. We'll find peace again." Jake nodded, his grip tightening on my hand. "We will. And we'll do it together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a small but powerful shift inside me. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. We had taken the first steps toward reclaiming our lives, and while the road ahead was uncertain, it was also filled with hope. Claire's obsession had driven us to the brink, but it hadn't broken us. We were still standing, still fighting, and now we had the chance to build a future free from the shadow of fear. That night, as I lay in bed next to Jake, I closed my eyes and let out a deep breath. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time I believed that we could make it. We had escaped Claire's clutches, and now it was time to focus on healing, on rebuilding, on finding peace in a life that was truly our own. The first few weeks in our new home were filled with a strange mix of relief and lingering anxiety. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. The house was cozy, the neighborhood was quiet, and for the first time in months we were far away from Claire. But the trauma we had endured wasn't something that could be left behind as easily as packing up and moving. It followed us, seeping into the corners of our new life. Jake and I tried to create a sense of normalcy. We unpacked our boxes, hung up our favorite photos, and started to explore the small town we now called home. There was a beautiful park nearby where we took long walks, trying to reconnect with the peace that had once been so natural to us. But despite our efforts, the shadow of Claire's obsession still loomed large. Every time the doorbell rang or the phone buzzed, my heart would race. Even though we had changed our numbers and were careful not to leave any trace of our new address, the fear that Claire might somehow find us never completely went away. It was as if we were living with a constant, low-grade panic that refused to let us fully relax. One evening, as we were sitting on the back porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset, Jake finally voiced the thoughts that had been weighing on both of us. "I keep expecting her to show up," he admitted, his voice quiet but tense. "Even though I know we did everything we could to cover our tracks, I can't stop thinking about what if it's not enough." I nodded, feeling the same knot of anxiety in my stomach. "I feel the same way. It's like she's still with us, even though she's not here. I keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen." Jake sighed, setting his cup down on the small table between us. "This isn't how I want to live. We can't let her control us from a distance like this. We need to find a way to move on." "I know," I agreed, though I wasn't sure how to make that happen. "But I don't know where to start. The fear is still so strong." "We should talk to someone," Jake suggested. "A therapist, maybe. We've been through a lot and we need help dealing with it." The idea of therapy had crossed my mind before, but now, hearing Jake say it out loud, it felt like the right thing to do. We had tried to handle everything on our own for so long, but the burden was too heavy. We needed someone to help us navigate the complex emotions we were dealing with. "I think that's a good idea," I said, feeling a small sense of relief at the prospect of getting help. "We've been carrying this alone for too long." The next day, Jake found a therapist who specialized in trauma and anxiety, and we scheduled our first session. The idea of opening up to a stranger was daunting, but I knew it was necessary. If we ever wanted to truly move on from what had happened, we needed to confront it head-on. Our first session was difficult. The therapist, Dr. Lawson, was kind and patient, but revisiting everything that had happened with Claire was painful. It brought back memories I had tried to suppress, and the emotions I had been holding at bay came rushing to the surface. Jake and I took turns explaining what we had been through. The fear, the stalking, the sense of helplessness that had pervaded our lives for so long. Dr. Lawson listened carefully, offering gentle guidance and helping us to unpack the trauma we had experienced. You've both been through an incredibly difficult time, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. It's completely understandable that you're still feeling anxious and fearful. Trauma like this doesn't just disappear when the immediate threat is gone. It takes time to heal. But how do we stop living in fear? I asked, my voice trembling. It feels like no matter how far we run, Claire is still with us. The key is to take small steps toward reclaiming your sense of safety, Dr. Lawson explained. It's about finding ways to remind yourselves that you are safe now, even if it doesn't always feel that way. Therapy will help you process what you've been through. But it's also important to create new routines, new memories, and new experiences that aren't tied to the fear you've been living with. Jake and I left that first session feeling emotionally drained, but also hopeful. For the first time since Claire had re-entered our lives, it felt like we had a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but we were committed to doing whatever it took to heal. As the weeks went by, we continued our therapy sessions, gradually working through the layers of trauma that had built up over the past few months. Dr. Lawson helped us develop coping strategies for dealing with anxiety, and slowly, we began to feel more in control of our lives. One of the things that helped the most was focusing on creating new, positive memories. Jake and I made a conscious effort to explore our new town, finding joy in the little things, a hidden cafe with amazing coffee, a scenic hiking trail that led to a breathtaking overlook, a quaint bookstore where we could lose ourselves for hours. These small moments of happiness became anchors, grounding us in the present and helping to push back the fear that had dominated our lives for so long. But the fear didn't disappear overnight. There were still nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I had heard Claire's voice outside our window. There were still moments when a phone call from an unknown number would send a spike of panic through my chest. But each time, Jake and I would remind ourselves of the steps we had taken, the distance we had put between us and Claire, and the life we were slowly rebuilding. One evening, about 2 months after we had moved, Jake and I decided to take a weekend trip to the coast. It was something we had talked about for years, but had never found the time to do. Now it felt like the perfect opportunity to reconnect with each other and celebrate the progress we had made. The drive to the coast was peaceful, the kind of road trip where the journey itself felt just as important as the destination. We listened to music, talked about our plans for the future, and allowed ourselves to enjoy the simple pleasure of being together without the constant weight of fear. When we arrived at the small beachside town, we checked into a cozy little inn and immediately headed down to the shore. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was soothing, and as we walked along the beach I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a long time. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the water, Jake took my hand and led me to a spot where we could sit and watch the sky change colors. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, his voice filled with contentment. "A chance to just be without all the noise and stress." I nodded, leaning my head against his shoulder. I can't remember the last time I felt this peaceful. We sat in silence for a while, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in shades of pink and orange. It was a perfect moment, one that felt like a turning point, a reminder that there was life beyond the fear, that we could find happiness again. As we walked back to the inn, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. We had been through so much, but we had survived. We were stronger now, more resilient, and most importantly, we were together. That night, as we lay in bed listening to the sound of the waves outside our window, I realized that the fear that had once consumed me was beginning to fade. It was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer controlled me. We had taken our lives back step by step, and now the future felt full of possibility. The next morning, we woke up to the sound of seagulls calling outside our window. The sky was clear and bright, and as we got ready for the day, I felt a renewed sense of optimism. We spent the day exploring the town, visiting local shops, and enjoying the fresh seafood that the area was known for. Every moment felt like a victory, a reminder that we were reclaiming our lives one day at a time. When we returned home from the trip, I felt a shift inside me. The fear that had once been so overwhelming had been replaced by something else. Hope. Hope that we could truly move on from what had happened, that we could find peace and happiness in this new chapter of our lives. Jake and I continued our therapy sessions, and over time the nightmares became less frequent, the panic attacks less intense. We still had our bad days, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. We were healing, slowly but surely, and each day brought us closer to the life we had always wanted. One afternoon, as we were sitting in our living room, sipping coffee and reading, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from our lawyer with an update on Claire's case. My heart raced as I opened it, but as I read the words on the screen, I felt a sense of relief. Claire had been formally charged with multiple counts of stalking and harassment, and she was being held without bail until her trial. The lawyer was confident that, given the evidence, Claire would face significant jail time. It was the closure we had been waiting for, the knowledge that she wouldn't be able to harm us or anyone else for a long time. When I told Jake the news, I saw the same relief in his eyes. We had been living in fear of what Claire might do next, but now we could finally breathe. The legal system was handling her, and we could focus on moving forward. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey to get here had been long and painful, but we had made it. We had escaped Claire's clutches, and now we were free to build the life we had always dreamed of. One filled with love, happiness, and the peace that had once seemed so out of reach. Thank you for following our journey. If you've ever faced a similar struggle, or if you're dealing with something difficult in your own life, know that healing is possible. It takes time, and it's not always easy, but with patience and support, you can find your way back to peace and happiness. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, or any advice you might have. Let's continue to support each other as we move forward into a brighter future. With Claire finally behind bars, a weight we hadn't realized we were still carrying began to lift. It was as if we had been holding our breath for months, and now, for the first time, we could exhale. The news that she wouldn't be able to harm us or anyone else for a long time was the closure we had desperately needed. But as much as her arrest brought relief, it also left us with the task of fully rebuilding our lives. The fear had been our constant companion for so long that living without it felt strange, almost unfamiliar. We knew we had to redefine what normal looked like for us, to reclaim our happiness in a world where Claire no longer had power over us. Jake and I continued our therapy sessions, which had become a crucial part of our healing process. Dr. Lawson helped us navigate the lingering effects of the trauma, guiding us as we worked to strengthen our relationship and our sense of security. We focused on the small victories, the moments when we could laugh freely, the nights we slept without interruption, the days that passed without a single anxious thought. We also began to plan for the future in a way that we hadn't been able to for so long. The trip to the coast had been a turning point, reminding us of the joy we could find in new experiences and adventures. We started talking about other places we wanted to visit, dreams we wanted to pursue, and the kind of life we wanted to build together. One of the first steps in that process was transforming our home into a true sanctuary. Up until now, it had been a place of refuge, but also a reminder of what we were running from. Now, with Claire no longer a threat, we wanted to make it a space that reflected our journey, our resilience, and our love for each other. We spent weekends redecorating, adding personal touches that made the house feel uniquely ours. We hung up new artwork, planted flowers in the garden, and created a cozy reading nook in the living room where we could curl up with a book and a cup of tea. It wasn't just about making the house look nice. It was about reclaiming it as a space of peace and happiness. As we settled into our new routine, the fear that had once dominated our lives gradually faded into the background. There were still moments when the old anxieties would resurface, a sudden loud noise, a phone call from an unknown number, but they no longer held the same power over us. We had learned how to cope, how to reassure each other, and how to find comfort in the life we were creating. One afternoon, a few months after Claire's arrest, Jake and I decided to host a small dinner party for some of our new friends. It was the first time we had entertained guests in our new home, and it felt like a significant milestone, a sign that we were finally moving forward, leaving the past behind. The evening was perfect. The food was delicious, the conversation was lively, and the house was filled with warmth and laughter. As I looked around the table at the people who had become part of our new life, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. We had come so far, and now we were surrounded by friends who supported us, who knew our story and celebrated our progress. After our guests had left, Jake and I sat together on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. The stars were bright overhead, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. "This feels like the start of something new," Jake said, his voice soft but full of emotion. "I feel like we're finally living the life we've been fighting for." I nodded, my heart swelling with love for him. "We are. We've been through so much, but we've come out the other side stronger. I'm so proud of us, Jake." He reached over and took my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm proud of us, too. We didn't let fear win. We took our lives back, and now we get to decide what comes next." As we sat there, holding hands under the stars, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. The fear, the trauma, the darkness, it was all behind us now. We had faced it together, and we had emerged from it with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The next morning, as the sun rose and filled our home with light, I realized just how far we had come. The nightmares that had once plagued me were now few and far between, and when they did come, I knew how to push them away. The panic attacks that had once made me feel so helpless were now a distant memory, replaced by a newfound strength that came from knowing I had survived. Jake and I continued to build our life together, one day at a time. We traveled, we explored new hobbies, and we made plans for the future that felt full of possibility. There were still challenges, of course. Healing isn't a linear process, but we faced them together, with the knowledge that we had already overcome so much. One evening, as we were sitting by the fire, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had been on. There was a time when I didn't think we would make it, when the fear and uncertainty seemed too overwhelming, but we had, and now we were living a life filled with love, joy, and peace. A life that was truly our own. "Do you ever think about what we've been through?" I asked Jake, my voice thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not as much as I used to. I try to focus on where we are now, and on how far we've come. We didn't let the past define us." I smiled, feeling the truth of his words. "We really didn't. We turned it into something positive, something that made us stronger." Jake nodded, his eyes warm with love. "And now, we get to write the rest of our story, on our own terms." As I leaned into his embrace, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought us to this moment, a moment of peace, of happiness, of knowing that we had taken our lives back. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the future was ours to shape. Thank you for being a part of our journey. If you're going through something difficult, know that there is hope on the other side. Healing takes time, and it's not always easy, but with the right support and a lot of patience, you can find your way back to peace and happiness. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, or any advice you might have. Let's continue to support each other as we move forward into a brighter future, one step at a time.